Amazon's BatchWriteItem functionality allows you to write multiple items to one or more tables in a single API call. Using BatchWriteItem, you can bundle multiple operations into a single batch, thereby reducing the number of API calls and the network overhead, leading to improved performance and reducing cost. BatchWriteItem is particularly useful for scenarios involving data ingestion, bulk data updates, or data cleanup tasks, allowing you to efficiently manage changes to DynamoDB tables. In this video, let's learn how to use the BatchWriteItem functionality when building .NET applications. We will see how to use the high-level and also the low-level API provided by the .NET DynamoDB SDK. Hello everyone, welcome back to this YouTube channel. My name is Rahul and I make videos around .NET. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my .NET on AWS series. The BatchWriteItem operation puts or deletes multiple items to one or more tables. A single call can transmit up to 16 MB of data over the network and consisting of up to 25 operations in one batch. The individual put or delete operations in the batch are atomic, however the BatchWriteItem as a whole is not. So if you send a batch of requests, some of them can fail and the rest can succeed. So you need to build your applications so that you handle these scenarios. In this video, we will explore how to use the BatchWriteItem to put one or more items to one or more DynamoDB tables. So let's switch over to Rider, where I have an existing solution open. This is the default ASP.NET Core Web API application, which has the weather forecast controller and also a bunch of DTO items that's associated with the API endpoints. I started building this solution when I started with the DynamoDB querying videos. You can check out the 5 different ways to query DynamoDB to see how this solution is set up. Now this has multiple functions in the controller and each of these represents an API endpoint which shows different ways you can interact with DynamoDB and the features it provides. Now in an earlier video we saw how to use the get batch operations and we added a couple of endpoints for that use case. Similarly, in this video, let's add multiple endpoints to see how we can use the BatchWriteItem and insert or update new items in DynamoDB. So let's scroll down and add a new method right before the HTTP post. So let's add a new HTTP endpoint. So let's say HTTP post and let's name this as BatchWrite. In this case, we will be using the DynamoDB context, which is the high-level API. So let's name this as DB context. Let's return a task and specify post batch write. Now since we need to add one or more items, let's take this and as a list of weather forecast items. Now see the simple post method takes only one item and writes a single item. However, in this case, we are going to bulk add data. Now the weather forecast item has the partition key as city name and the range key has date. Now in this particular case, when we were writing, we are making sure the date part has just the date and removing any time part for it. This ensures that only one item exists for a given date for a city. So in this case as well, let's loop through each of these items. So let's say for each items, and in this case, let's name this as item. Let's also apply that item.date is equal to item.date and the date part of it. Now if you want, you can remove the braces because this is just going to be one line. Now to add these items to the DynamoDB database, let's call the DynamoDB context, let's say the CreateBatchWrite method, which takes in a generic type. Now this is going to be the type that represents the DynamoDB table object. Now in this case, it is weather forecast. We saw in a different video how DynamoDB context uses conventions to determine the table name from the items that we provide. You can check that video linked here or in the descriptions below. So once we create the batch write, so let's get this as a variable. So let's say batch write is equal to the item that is returned by this, which is an object of batch write. Once we have the batch write, so let's use the add put items call to add one or more items. You can also use the put item if you want to add the items one by one. So let's call the add put items and pass in the full items collection. This builds up the batch write operation with all these items. Once that is complete, we can use the batch write and call the execute async and make sure to await on this. This invokes the write action to DynamoDB table. So let's put a breakpoint here and run this application to see this in action. The application is running and it launches the Swagger UI for this API. So let's scroll down. right before the post, we have the BatchWriteDPA context method. So let's expand this, and this already has one item in here that's automatically populated for us. So let's try it out. Let's update the city name. Let's specify Brisbane. It's for the day 23/8/14. And let's make the temperature as 10. So let's execute this, which hits the breakpoint as expected. So this loops through the items and updates the date to be just the date part. It creates the batch write item and then adds the one item into this batch write. Once that is done, it calls the execute async, writes it to DynamoDB, and returns the call. Now, if we navigate over to the AWS console, let's go to the DynamoDB, go to Tables, Weather Forecast. Let's go under Explore Table Items. Let's click Query and look for Brisbane partition key. Let's sort by descending so that the latest items comes on top. So once we click Run, you can see this item is in here. So let's open this and you can see the temperature is 10. So let's navigate back. And let's see if we can add a couple more items. So we don't have anything for 8/14 and a couple of days before that. Let's come back to this UI. Let's now add multiple items. So let's copy this and let's create a copy of this item. So let's specify comma and let's paste this below. So let's add 3 items. Now let's update the date time. So let's scroll down and change the city date time to be 13th. And let's also update the next one to be 12. While we're there, let's also change the temperature. So let's make this as 8 and let's make this as 10 and let's make this as 12. And let's click execute. Now this hits the breakpoint as expected. So let's continue the execution, which completes it and writes the batch items to the database. So let's switch over. Let's go to the items and let's click run again. Now here you can see there's 3 items inserted for 14, 13 and 12. You can also see the temperature for these items as 12, 10 and 8. So we have successfully inserted multiple items in a single API call to DynamoDB. Now you can send up to 25 items as long as it is below the 16 MB limit. Let's switch over to Rider. Here in this particular case, we are writing only to a single table. However, using BatchWrite, you can also write to multiple tables in a single operation. To see that, let's create a copy of this endpoint and create a new endpoint. Let's call this as BatchWriteMultiple. Let's also update the function name to be post-BatchWriteMultiple. Now in this particular case, we'll need to take 2 different lists of items so that it represents 2 different data types. So let's create a new class inside here. So let's create a public class BatchItems. And let's create 2 properties in here. So let's say list of weather forecast. So let's specify this as the batch1. And let's also create a list of weather forecast table items, which represents a different table. So let's specify this as batch2. Now, instead of taking just one list of items, let's now take this batch item. Now, once we have that, to loop through this, let's call batchItems.batch1. And this works as the same. So instead of putting the items, let's call the batchItem.batch1. Now similarly, we can add the batch2 as well. So let's copy all of this and let's duplicate this for the batch2. So let's specify this as batch2. Let's make sure to update this as batchWrite2. And let's create and add the items of batch2 inside here. We also need to make sure that the create batchWrite is on the appropriate type. So in this case, it's going to be weather forecast table. So let's call the add put items on BatchWrite2. Now this fixes all the compilation issues. However, we're just calling the execute async on the batch write. Instead of that, let's combine these 2 batches into a single batch. So let's specify where batches is equal to BatchWrite dot combine and specify the BatchWrite2. Now this combines both these batches into one and returns a multi-table BatchWrite instance. Now once we have that, we can call the execute async on the batches instead of the individual batch. This makes sure both these batches are written in the same API call as long as the limits apply. So let's put a breakpoint here. Let's run this and let's see this in action. Let's scroll down to the new item. So let's go to the post weather forecast BatchWrite multiple DB context, which is the new method that we just added. This takes in 2 lists of items, which is batch1 and batch2. So let's try it out. Let's update this to be Brisbane. Now this is for 14th. So let's change the temperature to be 7, and let's also specify the second batch to be Brisbane. And in this case, let's keep the temperature as 10 so that we see the difference. Now this is both for the same date. So let's click execute, which hits the breakpoint as expected. It goes through each of these batches and it creates the BatchWrite item and it adds the items to that particular BatchWrite. Now once that's done, it goes to the second batch and it creates the appropriate table batch request and adds it to that as well. Once we have the combined item, we can call the execute async and it writes these items to the DynamoDB tables. Now in your scenario, you might be writing to completely different tables and different objects based on your use case. You can also create multiple such batches and combine them together. So now let's switch over to DynamoDB in the AWS console and let's run this query again. Now if I scroll over to the right, you can see the date time is 7, which is what we passed for that particular item. If we switch over to the weather forecast table and let's click a run on the Brisbane partition, let's make sure to sort descending and click run. Now here you can see for 8/14 and the temperature C is 10 degrees Celsius. This is exactly what we entered for that particular date. Now you can update this alone if you want. So let's say 15, it makes both the request. So let's click execute and let's continue this execution. Now if I switch back and refresh this item, you can see that temperature is now 15. Instead of using the combine on the BatchWrite, you can also use the CreateMultiTableBatchWrite option. So let's specify where batches is equal to DynamoDB context.CreateMultiTableBatchWrite. Now this again takes a params of BatchWrite operations and combines them into a single multi-table BatchWrite operation. So in this case, all we need to do is pass the BatchWrite and the BatchWrite2 as params to this function. Now this creates the exactly same batches object and you can call execute on this like before. Now in both these scenarios, we use the DynamoDB context, which is the HighLevel API in the dotnet SDK. We can also use the low-level API, which is the Amazon DynamoDB client. Now in this particular constructor, we have both of them injected into the class. So you can see DynamoDB context and also the Amazon DynamoDB. So let's see how we can use the lower level API and write the same operations into the table. Let's copy this and let's create a new function right before the HTTP post. So let's paste this in here and let's make sure to close the brackets. Now in this case, this is going to be post-write DB client. Now in this case, it's not going to use the DynamoDB context, but the DynamoDB client. So let's specify BatchWrite client. Let's also modify this function to be client. Now this takes in the list of weather forecast items like before. Now if we use the DynamoDB client, you can see there is a BatchWriteItem async operation. This has multiple overloads. One of them uses the BatchWriteItem request. So let's specify the batch request and let's create this right before that. So let's specify batch request and new BatchWriteItem request. Now in the BatchWrite request, you can pass the request items, which is going to be a dictionary of string and a list of write request. So let's create that and let's pass in the items for this dictionary and the list of write request. Now the first string, which is the key in the dictionary, represents the table name. So in this case, this is going to be name of the weather forecast, which is going to be the table name as well. And also let's create a list of write request. We can create this from the items that we are passing in. So let's specify items.select and let's convert this into new write request. So let's create a new instance of write request inside here, which further takes in whether it's a delete request or a put request. In this example, since we are adding the data, let's create a new put request. This further takes a dictionary of string and attribute value pair. This represents all the properties of the items that we are trying to write. Now we can convert each of these items into a string attribute value pair using some of the DynamoDB helper methods in the dotnet SDK. So let's use the document class from the dotnet SDK and specify the from, and let's specify the from JSON method and pass in our item as a JSON object. So let's use the JSON serializer. Let's pass serialize and let's pass the data to it, which is going to be a in this case. So let's make sure to enter this in a new line. Now, once we have the item in the document format, we can call the toAttributeMap method on this, which returns it as a dictionary of string and attribute values, which is exactly what this put request requires. Now once we have called the select on this, let's convert this into a list because that is what this particular dictionary is expecting. It's expecting a list of write request. Let's make sure to end this statement using a semicolon. Now the JSON serializer is going to use the default serializer options. Now I need to ignore the null values because that is how DynamoDB items expect the items to be passed in. If it is null, we don't pass in that attribute. To do that, I can pass in a new JSON serializer options and also specify the default options. To do that, I need to pass the default ignore condition and specify this to be when writing null. So this will ignore the null values when converting this into a JSON object. So let's format this. So let's also pass in the attributes in a new line. So all we are doing here is making the items into the new write item request format. We pass in the put request. Now since the put request requires the items to be of dictionary of string attribute value, I'm using the document model to convert our item into a document object and then call the toAttribute map to get it in the appropriate format. Let's pass the request to the BatchWriteItem async. Let's say where response is equal to await and make this call on the DynamoDB client. So let's put a breakpoint here and see this in action. So let's run this. Let's scroll down. Right before the post weather forecast, we have the BatchWrite client. Let's click try it out. Let's specify the city. Let's specify Brisbane. Let's specify the date as 15 and let's say the temperature is 13 in this case and click execute. Now this hits the breakpoint as expected. It creates the BatchWriteItem request. Now this creates a new dictionary of the weather forecast and the items to be added to weather forecast. Now in this batch request items, you can see this is going to expand and it has the key of weather forecast and it has one item which is of type write request. This further has the put request object and it has the items inside here. And this has the key value pair for all the attributes that's part of this particular item. So let's make sure to continue this execution and let's come back to the items inside DynamoDB, go to weather forecast. Let's click run on the city name of Brisbane and this has the new item which is for this date that we just added. So if we scroll on to the right, you can see the temperature as 13. Now you can also add multiple items in here like before. So all we need to do is copy this and create another item in this request. So let's specify this item should be on 8 of 14. Let's make mode the temperature to be 11. So let's say 11 and click execute and let's continue the execution. Now this runs as expected. So let's come back and if we click run again, you can see the data will be updated to be 11 for both these items. Now like before, we can also use this to write to multiple tables. So let's copy this again. Let's paste this in here and say post batch write and let's specify multiple client. So this is going to be multiple, which indicates it's writing to multiple tables. So instead of using the list, we can specify the batch object that we created earlier. So let's specify the batch items and let's say item. So in this particular case, we are going to say this is items.batch1 and it's going to select that. Now, if we need to create this for another table, all we need is to copy and paste this again. Instead of weather forecast, we're going to specify the table as weather forecast table. To convert the batch2, let's specify batch2 and we don't have to change anything else. Now, this is going to write to both these tables. So let's run this. Let's scroll down. Let's open the BatchWrite multiple client. Let's click try it out. Let's change this as Brisbane 14th. Let's make the temperature as 5 and let's also change the batch2 to be Brisbane and the temperature to be 5 again. Let's click execute. This runs as expected. So let's come back to these items and let's refresh this. And we can see the temperature is now updated to be 5 for the date of 14th. Now if I navigate to the weather forecast table and click run on this particular table, you can see this temperature is also updated to be 5. So in the same request, in this case, we wrote to two different tables and updated them at the same time. Let's put a breakpoint here to see the response object. So let's click this run on it again and it hits the response as expected. Now, if you look at the response, you can see as a property in this, we have the unprocessed items. This represents any of the items that has not been processed as part of this request. So let's say we exceed the number of items or the maximum allowed data. In these cases, the unprocessed items would be populated. Now, in the cases where this response .unprocessed items is returned as an item, you can reprocess this in a subsequent request as a different batch. Now, I highly recommend checking out the documentation, which gives some information on how to efficiently retry on these batch failures. I hope this helps you to understand how to write items in a batch to DynamoDB. We learned how to use both the high-level API and also the low-level API to write data in batches. We saw how we can write to a single table and also to multiple tables in DynamoDB. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.